Nice of you to join us. If I'm going to stop your video so it improves the quality of our connection, or you can stop your own. Annie, don't forget to pass back the hosting. Or I can just reclaim it, can't I? No, I can't. You have to pass it back to me, Annie. So I'm sure this is your doing, Nicola, but we suddenly got a rush of people signing up. So last time I looked, I think it was nearly 90, which was fantastic. It's very exciting.
Very good.
No, it's very good. And I think it's just an interesting topic. I can see we're now getting lots of people joining us. Vince Cable just joined us. Good to have you, Vince. And various people I know and lots of people I don't know, which is always exciting too. Give us a moment to everyone who's joining us. Lovely to see you. Good to see you, Vince and Joe, David. David, send me your email address. So for those that aren't are just listening in the background, David Colin Thurmey has just joined us, and he is one of the co-authors of the new Radix Health paper, which we will be publishing this week. And if you, David, send me your address, I will send you some hard copies of the document. Meanwhile, I'm going to turn your video off. And once you've joined, please turn your video off. It helps improve the quality of the call. We'll be giving it just a couple more minutes before we start. Nicola, did you receive my email? Yes, you did.
Yes, I did.
Good. Nice to see you, William. Good of you to join us. Hope you're well. So we're now up to 21. So we've got some way to go, but we'll give people just a little bit longer to log in. As you join, thank you very much. Please mute yourself and turn off your video, which will improve the quality of our feed, or I will turn off your video for you, or Annie will do it for you. We will be tweeting and social mediaing and recording everything that we're doing. So as Annie has just put in the chat function, if you do put a question or a comment in chat, please include your Twitter handle. That helps us enormously. Or you can do as I've done and just rename yourself, including your Twitter handle, and that's makes it even easier. But I understand some people won't want to do that. If you don't want your name to appear on the Facebook feed, then change your name to something bizarre or more exciting. Just giving people a few more minutes. I can see lots of people now coming in. Thank you very much for joining us, and please mute yourself and stop your video. Charlie, good to see you. We're working on the layout of the paper that Charlie has written for us, which follows it up our session a few weeks ago on relationships with China, which we will be publishing again over the next fortnight. So lots of things coming out from Radix at the moment. Fantastic to see so many people. One more minute. Paul, nice to see you. I'm going to stop your video. Say improves the chances of us not going down. We have over 80 people registered. So whilst I'm sure some people won't show up, we still have some way to go. Thank you to all those who joined us. For those that are joining for the first time, welcome to Radix. This is the third in our series, and I shall be introducing us in just a moment. So I'm going to start recording and start now. So this is your last chance to change your name if you don't wish to. So good evening and welcome to the third in Radix's series looking at constitutional issues. as those who've been here before will know, our aim is to try and discuss issues and put forward proposals which either the government might engage with, much as some of us, I know, on this call will be in favour of a fair voting system. I'm not certain it's about to happen over the next 4.5 years. But we wanted to focus very much on issues that the government might engage with, or else would be under obligation to engage with. They'd have no choice but to do so. So we had a session with Alan Rushbridger, and you will find that on our Facebook page, looking at relationships with media. We had a session with Simon Jenkins, which was included in your invite to this event, looking at the role of localism. And our third is looking at the state of the union and what we can learn from COVID from that, but also from Brexit. And I'm really delighted and excited to have Lord John Alderdice is our guest speaker in that. John and I met about 1 million years ago when he looked exactly the same and I looked an awful lot thinner, but he was the leader of the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland and one of the most impressive politicians I've ever met. He's going to be in conversation with Nicola McEwen, and just before I introduce her, just to say they're going to have a conversation as we've done in the previous calls, and then we will bring in others to speak. You can either pose your own question or include your own comment, or alternatively or additionally put it in the chat function, which everybody knows their way around Zoom these days, but if you're new to it, if you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat box. Click on that and the chat will appear in the corner, and then enter your comment or question there. Help out my colleague Annie, who is managing the media, the social media for us, by including your Twitter handle in that. If you have a Twitter handle, please stop your video and mute yourself during the rest of the call, because that will help us enormously with the quality of the communications. Our chair today is Nicola McEwen, who, again, it's very, very exciting to have you, Nicola. Nicola is currently the co-director of the Centre of Constitutional Change at Edinburgh University. She's been there for the best part of 2 decades, she tells me, as a lecturer and senior lecturer, and since 2014 has been chair of territorial politics. She is an expert in the challenges that the Scottish independence referendum has raised in the relationship with the rest of the UK, and also Brexit, and now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. She's also a senior research fellow at UK and a Change in Europe, which, if you don't know, is an academic think tank supported by the Economic and Social Research Council, she tells me I should tell you. But it's a very good, unbiased source of information about the Brexit process. So she's very focused on Brexit, on devolution and the Union. She tells me her ambition in her spare time is to start bagging Munros, which I think is a brilliant ambition. And for those that don't know what she's talking about, go and bag a Munro. Nicola, over to you to introduce John and the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks. It's a pleasure to be invited to chair the discussion that's very close to my professional heart, and to be joined by such an important figure who's played such a critical role in the politics of the Union, and especially, of course, in the peace process in Northern Ireland. In the last 30 years, as many of you will know, Lord Alderdice has been involved in almost every aspect of the Irish peace process. As leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, he played a crucial mediating role in the cross-party talks, and also then became the first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, overseeing its first, probably a little rocky few years in the history of devolution in Northern Ireland. Since then, he has been involved in a number of initiatives related to maintaining the peace and stability in Northern Ireland, and wider afield as well, both in his work in the House of Lords and as his role as director of the Centre for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict, of which you have much experience, I'm sure. John, welcome to the discussion. I thought we would begin by talking about Northern Ireland. You were a key player in the peace process in a number of different roles. The executive this year has come back together after a lengthy hiatus. How do you see the future of devolution in Northern Ireland just now? Do you see it as back on a stable path, or is it likely to face further instability? Oh, you are on mute, John. Sorry. You have to unmute yourself.
There we go. We okay now?
Yep, perfect.
Lovely. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for your kind welcome, and indeed to Ben and colleagues for the invitation to join you and talk about these issues this evening. The difficulties of devolution in Northern Ireland are a little bit more complex in some ways than the issues of devolution in other parts of the UK because of the history, and not least the history of violence. Once a terrorist campaign enters into the situation, the dynamic changes and all sorts of things happen which are not easily forgotten or set to the side. And that's very relevant in Northern Ireland because each time there is some sort of setback, you'll find people regressing back to either their old identities and adherences. Famously, Gerry Adams at one stage, when there was some questions about devolution and was addressing a crowd at the front of Belfast City Hall, someone asked about the IRA and he said, "They haven't gone away, you know." And that was a way of kind of appealing to some of his colleagues when others had hoped that they had gone away. Similarly, on the unionist side, whenever people feel disenchanted, there's a lot of talk about victims, about those who suffered at the hands of the IRA, and demands that those who are in the current leadership of the Republican movement distance themselves from that. And of course, when the opposite happens, for example, recently the funeral of Bobby Storey, and huge numbers of people come out to celebrate his life from their perspective and do it in the middle of a COVID pandemic, it raises all the old difficulties and questions. Having said that, there was a great struggle to get devolution back on track after a period of time when it had been off the agenda. Sinn Féin addressing more of the questions of what was happening politically in Dublin, and the DUP a little bit newfangled with the influence that they had with the Conservative government at Westminster. However, I think most of us took the view that some of this was because the two parties did not also want to take any responsibility for the Brexit process. They wanted the British government, the Irish government to do the heavy lifting, and then they could complain and criticize whatever they did. And that once that was out of the way, the probability was that devolution would come back, because from a unionist point of view, devolution is the way of trying to keep Northern Ireland stable within the UK. From a Sinn Féin point of view, it means that they are in government in one part of Ireland and able to have the ambition to be in government on both sides of the border in Ireland. And so getting devolution back was always something they were likely to do. However, that doesn't mean that it's devolution without some trajectory. And it does seem to me that while devolution is likely to survive, there is a trajectory towards a united Ireland would be the traditional way of describing it. It might not be an entirely adequate way of describing it, because of course it probably won't be a unitary state and it will retain relationships with the rest of the UK. But nevertheless, the trajectory, I think, is clear. And partly that's because the DUP, while they've been clever at tactics, they've been very poor at strategy. They've never really been able to see the big picture, that you might make some decision for the moment, which would get you a little bit of credit and credibility with the electorate, appeal to the identity questions, but not really thinking about the long-term strategic questions. famously, for example, saying, we're going to smash Sinn Féin. Well, not only did they not smash Sinn Féin, they actually did things which strengthened Sinn Féin. The whole Brexit business, voting for Brexit, when actually the best way of staying within the UK was if the UK stayed within the European Union. So strategically not good, albeit tactically quite clever. But I think the trajectory is clear. What we don't know is timescale and exactly how. And that's true of everything in politics. Anybody thinks they can predict politics, well, if you thought that a few years ago, you might be forgiven. But given the kinds of outcomes of elections and referendums and so on in the last few years, only a very foolish person would try to predict the outcome of politics. And I don't think we can do that. But we can look at trajectories and we can try to see influences. And I think that's the direction that things are going in.
Lots of interesting issues raised there, and I, for one, would not want to try to predict what's happening next week, let alone next year or the year after that. We'll talk about all of those issues and unpack all of that. But can I just go back to where you started there? And Northern Ireland devolution was distinctive from the other devolution systems elsewhere in the UK for emerging from the peace process. Are we still in the peace process in Northern Ireland, or is that a moment of history now?
I think we're past it. I think we're now in a political process rather than a peace process. If you went back 20, 25 years or more, we all thought that a political process would solve the violence problem. If we could bring together the broad mass of people, unionist side, nationalist side, across the centre, marginalise the people on the extremists, on the extremes, we could get a result. What we discovered was it was not possible to do that. We couldn't actually bring the violence to an end without engaging with the people who were doing the violence. That seems terribly obvious now. It wasn't at all obvious at that time. It was a huge struggle. But once you brought people in, you went through the process, you opened the doors that allowed people who'd been involved in violence to see another way of promoting their political agenda, it became possible for them to move away from it. And actually, I think in retrospect, come to understand that the violence had obstructed the outcome of their vision rather than promoted it. In fact, near the end of his life, Garret Fitzgerald, an extraordinary liberal Taoiseach in Ireland, wrote in the Irish Times that he was afraid the IRA had actually prevented the possibility of there ever being a united Ireland because of the bad blood they'd created. So once you got people into the political process, then although people would keep talking about the peace process, in truth, there is no expectation of any going back to the use of violence to bring an outcome. And I think it's actually quite important for people to understand that we're now in a political process, not a peace process anymore.
That's interesting. And the politics, of course, is very difficult too. And you talked about Brexit. Now, the interesting thing about Brexit in Northern Ireland is that it is such a polarising issue with the two communities. Of course, there's an emerging middle community that you've represented for a long time now too, but the two communities are at very different ends of that spectrum of debate on the future relationship with the European Union. The protocol, in some ways, was a compromise, an historic compromise, perhaps another constructed ambiguity for Northern Ireland to try to find some middle ground. But how do you see all of that developing in the future? Do you see further instabilities there when the protocol is implemented, or is it a way to maintain stability in Northern Ireland?
I remember when the Brexit referendum emerged as a political possibility and then subsequently certainty. Colleagues at Westminster, other Lib Dem colleagues said, well, now, John, you need to run a Remain campaign. And I said, I'm not going to do that. And they said, what, do you not believe in the European Union? I said, yes, of course I do. But I'm not going to run a Remain campaign because I'll tell you what it will do. It will polarize the community again. The people on the national side, Sinn Féin, SDLP, will vote Remain. The Alliance Party will vote Remain. But if we push, and particularly me as a former leader of the Alliance Party, pushes a Remain campaign, it will push all the unionists together into a Brexit position. So they said, well, what are you going to do? You're not going to do anything. I said, oh, yes. What we're going to do is we're going to run a public conversation where we explore all the issues that are involved. And we will get everybody, Brexit, Remain, everybody on the same platform together, in the same groups together, to explore the questions, to think about them and talk about them. And that's what we did. And we got together students, and another place we got together people who live around the border, or lawyers or business people or whatever. And we got people to discuss the issues. We brought Nigel Farage over 2 or 3 times. And the more times Nigel Farage came over, the more people wanted to vote for Remain. But he and his colleagues felt, well, you know, at least we're getting a chance to put our view. What was the result? The result was, yes, Sinn Féin, SDLP Alliance all voted Remain, but the Ulster Unionists decided overwhelmingly that they were going to vote Remain. And the DUP leader, Arlene Foster at the time, when she was asked about it after this public conversation, she said, well, we've discussed it, and on balance, we've decided to vote for Brexit. I regarded that as a victory. The DUP had decided on balance that they were going to do something. And actually, it was a perfectly legitimate position for them to take, an ill-advised one, but that was fine. But what it meant was that the unionist community was not united for Brexit. Many unionist young people, unionist business people, farmers around the border, in the course of this conversation began to say, well, we need to be very careful about this. The outcome could be a very difficult and challenging one for us. And that is actually what has happened. And there's now in Northern Ireland much more of a thoughtful conversation, which is about social and economic issues and the relationship with the rest of the island, with the European Union, as well as all the kinds of traditional questions. And of course, the Alliance Party and that broad centre ground has actually increased to the point where there are now really 3 cohorts in Northern Ireland: the Nationalist Republican one, the Unionist and Loyalist one, but there's also this cohort of younger people and not so young people in the east of the province, but extending beyond that, who are saying, you know, we've got to address the future, not keep going back to the past. And we feel a very different future set of possibilities. So I think this is very encouraging, really. And it also raises the same kinds of questions about how things might go with the relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom as it currently is.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, and thinking about the protocol specifically, the compromise in the exit agreement, implementing that will, to some extent at least, present a regulatory border in the Irish Sea. Now, how much of a border that is will depend on the future direction that the UK government takes and how much it seeks to diverge from European Union regulations. Does that create difficulties for the status of Northern Ireland? Does it create difficulties for the DUP in particular, perhaps? And is that perhaps part of the trajectory that you see towards a united Ireland?
You're absolutely right. It does, of course, depend on how exactly the British government handles things, but it was a profound shock to the DUP when the ERG 100% voted with the government for the protocol. They felt sure that a number of them, maybe a large number, possibly even sufficient to make sure it didn't happen, would vote with them. They had talked with them, they'd worked with them. They were really very confident about this. And when the ERG said, well, actually, no, in the end, we're not concerned about that. It was a devastating shock and blow to the DUP because they knew the consequence, which was exactly what you described. And that is, it does create a separate situation for Northern Ireland in customs terms. And they understand that that is part of this ongoing dynamic. Now, there's a whole lot of practical complexities to it and how it will work out, but it's absolutely clear the direction that things are going there. And it's also absolutely clear, and became very clear to them, that they could not depend at all on the word of a British Prime Minister. Not this one, frankly, not the previous ones either, but that's the direction it was going in, and they understand. And you know, there are also other interesting things. I've now moved over with my wife some time ago. I live in Oxfordshire. And so as I watch the news broadcasts here, every day we have Nicola Sturgeon coming on and speaking about the situation in Scotland, but broadcast to the whole of the UK. Every day we have Mark Drakeford coming on and describing the situation from his perspective as the First Minister. We don't every day have a broadcast from the British government, but for a period of time we did. not always the Prime Minister, in fact, rarely the Prime Minister, but always a senior minister. We almost never, ever get a broadcast from the First and Deputy First Minister saying what is happening in Northern Ireland. And nobody ever says, wait a minute, why are we not having this? Why do BBC not make sure that they're broadcasting it? Why? Because already in themselves, the feeling amongst people is that it's a place apart. It's somehow separate in a very real way. And I think that's exemplified now in the politics of it, and the protocol is part of that process.
Mm-hmm. So this is just a reminder to those of you who have joined us to use the chat function if you want to ask a question or contribute to the discussion. Just following on from that point, Lord Alderdice, and moving it on to thinking about devolution across the UK, we've seen through COVID in some ways has highlighted the reality of devolution and perhaps made people in England aware of devolution in a way that they maybe hadn't been before. And yet, at the same time, we are seeing some initiatives reported today, for example, in the FT, from the UK government that seem, through the Brexit process, through concerns about the internal market, to perhaps seek to limit devolution and divergence in the future. So thinking now to devolution across the UK, do you see it as being at risk somehow, or do you see it as being challenged in some ways in the future, or do you look with envy at stability of devolution in the other parts of the UK?
Prior to this, I was of the view that Scottish nationalism was going to have considerable difficulty delivering, having failed, albeit quite close, but having failed to bring the result they wanted in the referendum, and that Wales had never been that strong on the independence question. But I think it comes back onto the agenda because of the way that the Prime Minister has been handling things. He has been making decisions, for example, that affect Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but particularly in this context, Scotland and Wales, without any proper consultation with the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales, never mind their parliaments. And although he may think that he can ride roughshod over that, I think what he is doing is, well, in the terminology we use nowadays, creating antibodies. I think he's actually stoking up considerable resentment against himself and his advisors, against London, and indeed to some extent against the link in the relationship. Now, there are lots of very good reasons why independence for Scotland is very much more problematic than it was before. Previously, people could say, well, the budget will be fine because of oil. Well, that's not the situation anymore for a whole bunch of reasons which we could talk about, but it's certainly not the case that oil is the future in terms of energy and solving the Scottish budgetary issue. When you're in the EU, staying within the EU, even as an independent country, was a real possibility, I guess, although the Spanish would have been difficult about it. But once you're actually out of the EU and applying to come into it as a separate country, you've got to get your independence first and then hope that you can get in, and there will be relatively modest leverage to do that. So I think there are considerable difficulties for Scotland. Having said that, the way the current British government is acting is, it seems to me, stoking up antagonism between people in Scotland and their representatives and people in Wales, if albeit to a lesser extent, and London. And I think that's a dangerous thing. I don't think it's at all clever, and I think it will create substantial problems. That's not to say that I'm clear what the outcome of that will be. It could become something that got handled very differently, but that, it seems to me, is what's happening at the moment.
So I think the title of this session was about reimagining the United Kingdom. If you were to reimagine the United Kingdom 10 years from now, does it still have the same borders?
I think it has the same borders. Whether those borders have become national borders as distinct from internal borders is the other question. I don't think, even in terms of Northern Ireland, I don't think the border itself is going to change, or there's going to be a referendum on exactly where the border goes, albeit that, you know, it's a crazy border that goes through the middle of people's houses and so on. That's not, I don't see that changing, but what that border represents, that's another matter. And it won't necessarily be that things will move overnight completely to a different constitutional construction. These things often change de facto before they change de jure. And I think that's the kind of thing that I can certainly see happening.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And just one question from me before I go onto the questions from the audience. You sit as a Liberal peer in the House of Lords. People often talk about federalism as, in some ways, it seems a magic bullet to try to resolve some of the issues that emerge around devolution and the relationships between the different territories of the UK. Do you see that as a possible resolution, as something that could help to address some of these dissatisfactions that are emerging?
I think federalism is much easier in theory than in practice. And there are many reasons for that, but one specific, really difficult reason is the size of England, in population terms, particularly more than in physical and geographical terms. It is just such a much bigger population, such a much bigger economy, and it has been pretty resistant to creating internal devolution within England itself. Now, I think there probably will be pressure for more power to go to local government, because it's quite clear central government has not been handling this pandemic at all well. But that's not the same thing as it moving towards the equivalent of Scottish Welsh or Northern Irish devolution. So although I think in theory it seems a good way to go, and maybe, you know, different kinds of representation in the House of Lords that would enable that to be facilitated, I think it's really quite problematic to implement in practice, and I don't think there's a big appetite on the part of this government. I don't think there's going to be that much appetite on the part of an alternative Labour or Lib Lab government either, at least on the Labour side, because the strength of Labour in Scotland is something that's going to be necessary in order to deliver a government in London that's an alternative to the Conservatives.
Thanks. And we had a question from Steve Comer, I think it is, in Cyprus. Steve, would you like to ask your question? If not, I will ask it for you. Steve was asking whether the Good Friday Agreement is a model, do you think, for other conflict areas, particularly in Catalonia, Flanders, though it's a different type of conflict in Cyprus as well. Do you see it as a model? Have you tried to talk about it in your international work as a model for conflict resolution?
I think it's very important to understand that the model emerges from the situation. And it's very foolish to take the particular model from any situation and think that it can simply be applied in another circumstance. However, there are some fundamental principles that we recognized in our process, which are absolutely applicable in other places. And one of the things is that when you have got long-standing conflicts of these kinds, what you have are disturbances of historic, difficult relationships between communities of people. It's not about individual relationships. It's about the relationships between communities of people. And when they've lasted a long time in a disturbed, a disrupted way, you've got to find a way of recognizing those and dealing with them. And the structures you create are structures that recognize and address those relationships. That's the thing that's crucial. And frankly, wherever I've gone in the world, that is what I've found when there have been long-term intractable problems. And there have generally been 2 or 3 major characteristics. One is that you find one or more groups of people that feel humiliated and disrespected by the way that they have been treated. Sometimes you find both sides feel that they've been humiliated and disrespected, and that just adds to the complexity and the difficulty of resolving it. You also find groups of people that feel they've been deeply unfairly treated, and they respond emotionally strongly to that. And these things are much more important than simple socioeconomic disadvantage, other than where it plays into those things. And the third thing is, you've nearly always found that people have made an attempt to resolve it using democratic politics And I've discovered after a while that it simply hasn't worked for them. And that's why they've often turned to violence, whether that's simply street violence or whether it's something more disturbed and disrupted than that. So those principles of human behavior are relatively universal, but it's important to not try to apply a particular model that you've worked out successfully in one place to other places. It generally doesn't work satisfactorily.
We have a few questions on Ireland and the future of the island. Charlie Duquesne, I hope I pronounced that properly, would like to ask a question. As someone born in Dublin, he would like to ask how changes that we're seeing south of the border are affecting Northern Ireland and the future of the Good Friday Agreement.
Charlie, do you want to add to that question before John responds?
A little bit. Thank you. So I was born and about 1/3 raised in Ireland, and I spent my adolescence there during the peace process, actually in Dublin and County Wicklow, where my family still live. And I moved away actually right away to Asia, and I've been going back a lot recently, and I've noticed that there's been a really big cultural change from top to bottom in how Ireland, the Republic, views its relationship with the UK and how it's become much more complex. So not just people like John Bruton, the former Taoiseach, having a portrait of George Redmond, the Home Rule advocate, on his wall, but Leo Varadkar saying he was a big fan of Winston Churchill, which would have been impossible 20 years ago to say, but he said it without any comment earlier this year. But my point is really, or my question is, part of the solution in Ireland is going to be that it would appear that the Republic and the processes going on in the Republic will allow for a different view of Irish-British relations than purely either conflict or complete separation. And I'd just be interested in your view of things from that side of the border.
I think you're absolutely right, Charlie. The changes in the South over a period of time have had a dramatic impact on people in the North. One of the first changes that had a huge impact was the election of Mary Robinson. And I remember talking to some loyalist women in East Belfast constituency that I was in, who were absolutely, blood orange. And they really loved the fact that this woman was getting elected and was confronting these men and standing up for people's human rights. And of course, she had been very critical of the Anglo-Irish agreement because she felt it wasn't addressing the sensitivities and concerns of unionists, had been negotiated outside of them, and so on and so on. But that sort of thing began to make a kind of change of attitude. Then the ghastly situation with the Catholic Church and all the horrible things that emerged about how children had been treated, abused physically, sexually, and the church had covered it up. This was devastating. It was devastating to older people who felt betrayed by a church they'd adhered to, and it was younger people just said, well, that's even worse than we thought. And so that had a huge impact, north and south of the border. The economic changes where in the past, people in the north have the shipyard, the aircraft factory, all sorts of robust relationships with the rest of the UK that helped economically. And then those things disappeared. And the south, which had not had an economic base at all, began to develop one in things like pharmaceuticals, the finance industry, and so on. And the infrastructure had improved enormously because of European regional development funds and so on. So all sorts of things began to change. The economy began to change, social attitudes began to change. Maybe one of the really striking examples of that during Leo Varadkar's government was when the abortion legislation was changed in the Republic, but had not been changed in the North. And so the health minister in Dublin said, any young women who feel that they need and want an abortion can come south of the border and we will make that available for them. I mean, that was just extraordinary. And of course, the whole situation of gay marriage, lots and lots of things which have changed enormously and have changed the attitudes of people in the North towards the South. The idea that this was a Catholic Church-dominated republic, I mean, simply nobody believed it anymore. Even people in the Protestant loyalist community didn't believe it anymore. So you're absolutely right, Charlie. These changes have had a major impact. Now, one of the impacts is that some people in the South aren't necessarily sure that they want a united Ireland anymore. I remember during the talks process, one of the very senior officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs who had been listening to some of the DUP talking, and William McRae was one of the leading figures at that time, now a member of the House of Lords. And he said, John, you know, I've been thinking about this question of the united Ireland. I said, Sean, I'm sure you have. He says, yeah, I've been thinking, you know, if we had a united Ireland, these guys in the DUP would be in the Dáil. And you know, somebody like William McRae might be the Minister of Agriculture, for example. I says, yes, that's absolutely right, Sean. He says, I'm going off to notion, John. I'm going off to notion. And so I don't think you can assume that everybody in the South thinks that it's an entirely good idea. And you also saw Leo Varadkar being a little bit cautious about the idea of calling a border poll too soon. A lot of people in politics, you know, it's a bit like asking people, do you want to go to heaven? They say yes. You say, would you like to go this afternoon? They say, well, actually, I'm not in a big rush. And so I think that there is a process to be gone through, but the trajectory, nevertheless, is the one that I've described. And what is smoothing the way towards that, Charlie, is what you've described as the social changes.
John, just following up from that, we had a really interesting question from Bill Roger, who is getting the impression from you that you see a united Ireland as inevitable. And just while you answer that, is there a way that if you were to be asked your advice, which I'm sure you would be, from the Irish government, if that were to be the process, how do we stop it becoming another peace process? How do we stop it staying on a political path? And is there something about the way that Ireland is governed, perhaps maintaining devolution, but within an Irish context, that might help to ensure that that process was as stable as it could be?
Well, the first thing is to say that there is nothing that is inevitable in politics. And politics is often hugely impacted by external events. I mean, you look at the civil rights movement that was at the start of the more recent outbreak of troubles in the 1960s. It happened in the context of civil rights marches all around the world. The big difference was that our issue was not the black-white issue, it was an orange-green issue. But it was happening in that broader context. Even if you go right away back to something like the 1798 rebellion, it took place in the context of a French Revolution, an American Revolution, and indeed, you would find if you went back to read the Belfast newsletter, which has been continuously published right since before the revolution, you'll be able to read, you know, Presbyterians and Catholics in the North talking about the French and American revolutions and saying that they wanted to have something of that kind as well. So there is a broader picture, and the broader picture is one of fragmentation. That's one of the reasons why there's a real warning to the United Kingdom about whether or not it will hold together. But it also means that you can't assume that Ireland will unite in the traditional way. In fact, I think it's unlikely that you're going to get a united Ireland of the kind that people thought about previously. Too much has happened. And if you look at the needs and political requirements of the two major party groupings, the DUP and Sinn Féin, the DUP obviously will want to retain some northern identity, and that would enable them to maintain some relationship with the rest of the UK. But Sinn Féin as well. Why on earth should Sinn Féin give up the certainty of being in government in part of Ireland and the opportunity in the rest, and go for a united Ireland where they might be out of government for a very long time? So there are lots of reasons why Northern Ireland might survive as an entity within a more united Ireland, but with special relationships with the UK, so that instead of being within the UK with a special relationship with the Republic, it could gradually move de facto to a position where it was within an Irish dimension with special relationships with the rest of the UK. Of course, there are some things that will be difficult to transition and finesse and all of that. One is, who do you pay your taxes to? Everybody's very clear. They may not all pay their taxes, but they know who they should be paying their taxes to. And policing is another one. You know, you need to know where the border is. And the Garda Síochána and the police service in Northern Ireland know exactly where the border is, because you have to, because it's a jurisdictional question. So there are some things that are very difficult to finesse in that way. But we can't, we can't know how things will work out in the future. And I'm certainly not saying that it's inevitable. Nothing's inevitable at all. But I'm saying that's the direction it looks like at the moment. And the broader context may help us understand a little bit about some of the elements of that. What I don't see happening is I don't see us going back to a campaign of violence. I don't mean that there won't be occasional shootings or bombings or something like that happen, but I don't see us going back to the kind of long-term terrorist violence campaign that we experienced over a period of 30 years. I don't see us going back to that.
Okay, I'm going to invite Joe Hayes to ask a question in a moment, but just before that, Jonathan Fryer was asking, and I think I know the answer to this one, but if the SNP was to win a big majority at Holyrood in next year's elections, do you see a second referendum as inevitable? Now, just that you said nothing is inevitable, but how do you see the UK government responding to that? To continue to ignore the request for a Section 30 order, or do you see the pressure forcing their hand?
I think if the SNP got a major victory, if they were overwhelmingly successful, I think it becomes extremely difficult for a government at Westminster to refuse a further referendum. However, I don't think that you should assume that some leading figures, current leading figures in the Conservative Party would necessarily be terribly troubled by that. Because the one thing that would make continuous Conservative government for the foreseeable future more likely than anything else would be Scottish independence. Because it's really very difficult to foresee how, with only England effectively, and perhaps England and Wales, a party other than the Conservative Party would be likely to win for the foreseeable future. So although in one sense you could say, would the British government be forced to it? There's also another question as to whether the whole of the British government would be united against wanting another referendum. And I think that's an open question.
And where do you see the Prime Minister in that?
I think the Prime Minister will probably do what he seems to have been doing consistently over the last year or so, and that is asking Dominic Cummings what he thinks.
Joe, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I seem to be invisible. Never mind. Oh, here I am. Yes, my question arises from years and years of trying to stop Brexit and trying to achieve all sorts of political ambitions. And I get the feeling very strongly that really everywhere outside London in the southeast, there's tremendous resentment of Westminster. And so, and I, being a lawyer, I'm very conscious that at the moment we've got an all-powerful Westminster Parliament. We can't actually move to a federation because the Parliament can abolish and devolved parliaments and retake its powers anytime it likes. So my question is, how can we move from Westminster model parliamentary sovereignty to a true federation of Britain, subsidiarity and not devolution?
Well, I think there's an important difference between the theory and the political reality. And I think, first of all, it's not the Westminster Parliament that's sovereign at the moment, it's the executive. Because in truth, unless you're a member of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, you're not going to get much daylight. And the House of Lords, even though the government doesn't have a majority there, the government is doing everything it possibly can to marginalize the House of Lords. So it's not just a question of a very powerful Westminster Parliament. The second thing is, although theoretically London could abolish the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and the Northern Ireland Assembly, in practical political terms, I think there's no likelihood whatever of that happening in any foreseeable future. So I think that the practical politics of it are that those institutions cannot be removed. But the big problem, as I said earlier on, is what about England? And I don't think that it is at all clear that the people of England themselves want internal devolution or federation or whatever. they've had opportunities to vote for that and they've shown very little appetite for it. Might that change? Well, of course, all sorts of things might change. My hunch is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, when the government has shown that central operations do not work, which of course is one of the reasons why you're right about the resentment, not just towards the government, but also towards the centralizing operations of Public Health England, for example, which is not properly engaged with municipal authorities who have responsibilities for health. I think you will see a wish to take some control back, but I think it will be to municipal authorities and cities and so on, rather than devolution on the model of legislatures that you have in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to invite Kevin Langford to ask his question in a moment, but just carrying on that note, there's been quite a bit of academic research that has identified a growing sense of English identity or Englishness, if you like, as distinct from Britishness, as it had been for quite a long time. Derek Macaulay was asking if that sense of Englishness means that is in some ways a barrier to imagining a sort of imagined community for Britain, and whether many or most English people care about whether Scotland leaves or whether Northern Ireland reunites with the South. And just from your perspective, your personal perspective, you live in Oxfordshire now, do you get a sense of that feeling of care, of solidarity about the future of the Union, or do they not care so much?
Oh, I don't think most people care at all about Northern Ireland, and they kind of heartily wish that it was taken away as a problem and an issue. It's troublesome and it's expensive, and they no real wish to be attached to it. Scotland's is a different agenda, really, and I think most English people recognise that Scotland's a different kind of place. It's a different set of relationships, and Wales different again. So I don't see the question of English nationalism of itself being a huge problem. You will not find any difficulty in being a Scotswoman, and yet being part of the United Kingdom and in that sense being British. I don't have any difficulty with the fact of being British, and indeed of being Irish for that matter. But no matter how long I live here, I'll never be English. I mean, that's just not on the agenda whatsoever. So where I live and how I feel and what I identify with are not exactly the same kind of thing. That means that the fact that there's English nationalism doesn't necessarily of itself lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, but it could contribute to it if there were other developments as well.
Kevin, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'm interested in what what seems quite likely a Scottish independence means for English politics, and two questions really. One is it really enough and likely enough that the parties are seriously thinking about what it means now and how that affects their strategies? And sort of related question is, you've talked a little bit about where the Conservatives are, but what would you advise, the new leader of the Liberal Democrats and Keir Starmer to be thinking about in that context?
It's funny, how difficult it is to get people to think and have conversations about issues which, even if you ask them, is this very likely? They would say, yes, absolutely. You say, well, why aren't we talking about this then? I mean, earlier on, Nicola was asking me about, north-south in Ireland. When Peter Robinson, after he was First Minister, not when he was First Minister, but after he was First Minister, he said, unionists need to be thinking about what a united Ireland would mean. And by the way, Dublin needs to be thinking seriously about it too, because there are all sorts of consequences. And nobody took him up on it in any serious fashion at all. So even though I've said it's likely, everybody else who thinks about it says it's a real possibility, there have been no serious conversations about it. And I think it's really important that there are, because conversations about these issues is a very good way of making sure that people do not turn to physical force to either promote or prevent some kind of an outcome. So my advice to anybody who's a leading figure in a political movement or party in England, Scotland, or Wales, is not to ignore these important developments, but to have conversations about them, not to try to create some kind of constitutional convention which will require endless negotiation and so on and so on, but start off simply by having serious conversations within your own party about what the consequences would be of this direction, what the consequences would be if that was the outcome, and to look at it not in terms just of what do I want or what do I not want, but what are the issues that are involved in this, socio-economic issues, but also cultural identity and political issues.
Thank you.
We've been, with the exception of the very first question, we've been quite UK-centric in this discussion so far, and yet some of the issues, the territorial issues that we're dealing with in the UK, we can see in many parts of the world, including amongst our European neighbours. I mean, how well do you think the European Union has helped to alleviate some of these territorial challenges? Has it done, or has it been something of a disappointment in that respect?
I have to be honest, as someone who has always been personally and politically very committed to the European ideal and the European project, it's been a disappointment to me, because the whole project started off with people recognizing that if we did not find a different way of relating, we would lapse back into violent conflict, as had happened repeatedly, but most particularly tragically twice in the first part of the 20th century. And so the people who were passionate about that development recognized that things like the development of the internal market, freedom to trade and to travel, the development of the euro, the European Parliament, all of these kinds of things were instruments to the purpose of peace, of having good, peaceful, prosperous, reconciled, stable relationships within Europe. But as time went on, something happened that happens in almost every kind of movement like this, political movement, religious movement, whatever. And that is, people begin to become attached to the instruments instead of to the purpose. And so in Europe, political leaders began to realize that here is a possibility for them as prime ministers of small European countries. They could be at the top table of global affairs if they were a European commissioner or a senior official in the European Union. And gradually those kinds of things, the regulation, the legislation, became more important than the building of relationships across Europe. And so what has now begun to happen is that people have become disenchanted with the European project, increasingly so, and some old borders and fragmentations are beginning to reappear. The south of Europe and the north of Europe is beginning to show some of the divisions there were 500 years ago at the time of the Reformation. Eastern Europe and Western Europe beginning to divide in the way they did 500 years before that with the Great Schism. The deep, deep cultural divisions beginning to open up. And Europe has not addressed those properly at all. It didn't, for example, when the Catalan problem began to emerge and Catalonian people and politicians began to say, look, let's talk politically about this. And Madrid says, absolutely not at all. Instead of Europe saying, well, come on, guys, we need to sit down. We need to have a little bit of a talk about this. They ignored it. Look at what's just happened in terms of Poland, the situation in Hungary. It's quite clear that these countries are not operating in the way that the European project was supposed to act. Is Europe addressing it in a serious way? No. And ultimately, that's going to be disastrous for the European project, which for me is a total tragedy and dangerous. Not that we're going to go back to the kind of way things were in the first part of the 20th century, but nevertheless, Europe is now becoming a source of disagreement rather than a focus and opportunity for agreement and working together. And I think that's tragic. It doesn't need to happen, didn't need to happen, but many people in Brussels and at senior levels in European countries don't seem to grasp the dynamic and what is happening.
Really interesting question from Joe Zamet Lucia, who says, rather than merely a disappointment, is having the perceived safe umbrella of the European Union something that has encouraged secessionist tendencies? And if that is the case, the EU's failure to respond to, for example, the most obvious example being the situation in Catalonia, where you have democratically elected politicians still in prison. how would you advise the European Commission, if they were to look for your advice, about how to respond to these scenarios?
Well, I would say to them that they need to look back at what these very thoughtful, shrewd people who devised the European project realized. From the start, they realized the power of nationalism. And so they established a European Commission, which would be much more powerful than any national civil service, where there would be people coming from all of the countries that were part of the project, but whose commitment would not be to simply represent their state, but to represent the European project. And for me, the next move that needed to take place to take out the sting of nationalism was to develop a Europe of the regions. And I was quite optimistic that that might be a possibility, because so many European countries, Germany, Spain, Italy, the UK itself, Belgium, so many countries are already established with regions, and there were a committee of the regions and so on, so was established. But one of the things that became clear was that national leaders did not want to let go of the nation state. And we've seen that emphasized in the pandemic. David Cameron went to Brussels to try to negotiate a bit of a change in terms of the freedom of movement, and they said absolutely not. At the drop of a hat, when the pandemic emerged, the borders went up to stop people traveling because of the problem of infection. I would say to people in Brussels, if you really want this project to work, then you need to go back to understanding what was understood after the Second War, which was the power of nationalism. And you need to understand that that has to be dealt with in a structural way, as well as in a cultural and emotional way. Otherwise, it has the potential to break the project, and that's a disaster.
Of course, we're coming to the end, and we suddenly have a flurry of questions. So if nobody minds, we'll run on for a few minutes more beyond the time. Bringing it back to the UK, we had a question from Facebook. We were also broadcasting, asking if it's more about a numbers game at Westminster, and if that makes radical change, such as a Celtic Federation or some radical reframing of the UK Constitution, does the numbers game at Westminster and the sheer dominance of English MPs make that really difficult to contemplate?
I don't think it's as simple as the numbers. I think it's questions of identity and culture and history. Although Wales and Scotland and Ireland, North and South, and indeed the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands and so on, which are represented in the wider framework that came out of the Belfast Agreement, although all of those places and peoples have relationships with each other, I don't think they see the future as some kind of Celtic Federation. I just don't. I don't see that they want to have good relations. They want to do things together, but I don't get any sense that they want to get together in that way. They want to paddle their own canoe. They want to have independence if that's what they want. They don't really want to submerge that in some other structure, which would have very modest economic advantages in comparison with relations with the EU.
And yet, constitutions don't change geography. We all have to occupy and share these islands. How do you see those relationships emerging, whether it's through some sort of governance structure, British Irish Council, for example? I mean, does that offer a model for managing the relationships across these islands under different constitutional scenarios?
Well, it's not just a potential model, it is actually in existence, but it hasn't been worked very hard. On the contrary, people have tended not to give much attention to it at all. And if more attention was given, if parliamentarians decided that they really wanted to do something with this, it wouldn't require any kind of constitutional change to change and develop it. But you know, geography is a funny kind of thing, because you might look at the island of Ireland and say, well, obviously that's one island, so the geography is that it would be operating together. But you see, if you go back 300 or 400 years, whenever people in the northeast of the island wanted to go and meet with other people to trade, to bring their cattle to market, Certainly, you know, to go to Kirk, for example, they didn't go south into the island. They got in a boat and they rowed across to the other side because actually that was safer than trying to go through the rest of the island. So people did not necessarily see the sea as a boundary for their community. They saw it as a transport route, and the kingdom of Dalriada was the south of Scotland and the northern part of Ireland. So geography, you're absolutely right, is more important. It comes before constitutions, but geography is often more complex in how it features in people's minds than simply looking at a map.
John, thank you so much. That's been a fascinating discussion. We didn't manage to get through everyone's questions, but hopefully we managed to satisfy most people there. I'm going to hand back to Ben, but just to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It's been great. Ben, over to you.
And can I just thank Nicola and John for what I think has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I'm just struck by how much we didn't cover, as well as how much we didn't. It's both frustrating and rewarding, because if there wasn't much left, then there wouldn't be much point in having an ongoing think tank. We are ongoing. One of the questions we didn't get to at the end was from Charlotte Aldrich, but for those who would like to hear from Charlotte, you can do in our final session of this series on the 22nd of July. Charlotte will be talking about local economics and what we can understand and learn from new economic models which are appearing under COVID. So thank you for that, and do join us for that. A couple of just parish notices. We've got an awful lot of policy papers in preparation at the moment. For those that weren't here at the beginning, you can hear read this week the launch of this paper. It's on health policy, written by Dr. Paul Goldsmith and David Colin-Terme and David Boyle, and it looks at reforms to the health service. For those that saw The Guardian over the weekend, you'll have seen that the government are considering how they can centralise it more, while we're calling for exact opposite. So watch out for that. We also have a paper on educational resilience coming from our youth wing, written by students about the impact of COVID and what you need to do about it, and then a paper also on China. So lots coming out. You'll have seen, because I can't help myself, the appeal for donations in the chat function. If you have joined this evening, we rely entirely on individual donations, and you can donate via the link which is in chat or via our website, and all support you can offer us is very much appreciated. Finally, one more thanks to Nicola for excellently chairing, and to John for a wonderful contribution. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next week on the 22nd of July for Charlotte. Goodbye.